Hi, everyone. Dr. Samantha Cutrara here, the Principal Storytelling Officer for the Histoire Source Story video series. So a couple months ago, we did a really cool live event, although we do pre-record it because my post-war internet, or no, not my post-war internet, my post-war building does not deal with internet very well. So we pre-recorded it and then we put it online as a premiere. We were able to tweet, and it was such a fantastic thing that we thought, why don't we do the same for Remembrance Day? And I'm so excited who we have to speak because she and I have been friends since I was a master's student and she was finishing her PhD, and to be able to see the type of work that she's been doing since that time has just been so fantastic. So today we have Dr. Kristine Alexander, who is the Canadian Research Chair in Childhood Studies at the University of Lethbridge. And we're going to talk about girlhood, teaching Canadian history, teaching war, remembering war, and it's just such a privilege to have this Remembrance Day conversation with you, Kristine. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Samantha. It's a real pleasure to be here. And gosh, I guess you were an MA student back when we first met, and talking of pre-war internet, and this was a long time ago.
That's right. We had that nice group, and I always felt like the junior babysitter, which was wonderful because I was able to learn so much from this wonderful group of PhD female historians, and it's been really cool to keep those connections. And I was saying before we started recording, I can't believe it's been you were able to get through the whole pandemic without me bugging you for an invitation. So I'm glad 2 years on, we got to do it.
Finally. No, I'm really, really thrilled. And I think that, having just been at the Canadian History of Education conference in Victoria, I came away from that super inspired about, talking about teaching, talking about evidence, and trying to push those conversations forward. So I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, and I mean, there's been so many people that are involved with that association who've been part of this series. Sean Carlton, Funke Eldejebe, Christina Llewellyn. And it's been so nice to be able to bring in history education and history of education to these conversations because I talk a lot in my book but also in the series about how important both connection and complexity is for young people. And when we focus on children, when we focus on childhood, when we focus on girls, boys, there are those connections but also the complexities. And so it's really exciting to be able to have that conversation with you today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But do you want to formally introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Kristine Alexander, and as Samantha said, I have a Canada Research Chair in Child and Youth Studies at the University of Lethbridge, which is located on Blackfoot territory in southern Alberta, where it's currently about minus 20 degrees at the start of November. And I am an associate professor in the history department, work with the Institute for Child and Youth Studies there. And as a historian, I would say that one of the main kind of animating questions that has guided a lot of my work is trying to understand the lived experience of young people in the past, and especially how that experience has intersected with and been shaped by global processes and events. So things like settler colonialism, but also I would say just as germane to our conversation today, the First World War.
Yeah, definitely. And you brought a source with you today so that we can have this conversation, right?
I did.
So would you like to share that source?
Sure, absolutely. So the source that I want to start our conversation with today is actually not a piece of conventional archival evidence. It's not a diary or a letter or a children's book. It's a stuffed animal. It's a teddy bear without legs. A teddy bear that's more than 100 years old that you can, if you're in Ottawa, you can go and check it out. It's in the permanent collections in the First World War galleries of the Canadian War Museum. So this teddy bear at the start of the First World War belonged to a girl named Aileen Rogers, an English-Canadian girl who lived on a farm near the town of Cowansville, Quebec, with her parents and her younger brother, Howard. In 1915, Aileen Rogers' father, Lawrence Rogers, decided to enlist. He joined up and became a stretcher bearer and later a medical officer. And as a keepsake, a memento, something to remember her by, or maybe even as a kind of a good luck charm, Aileen gave her father her teddy bear to take with him. And so he took it with him to Army training in Canada. It crossed the Atlantic with him, where he did further training in England. And it was also in his pocket when he was killed during the Battle of Passchendaele in the fall of 1917. So the bear, along with, a handful of other personal effects from Lawrence Rogers' body, were sent back to his family, who by that time had basically packed up the farm and moved to an apartment in Montreal. And then, along with his wartime letters, I think probably because the grief that his widow and 2 children were experiencing was so intense, they were essentially put away in an old suitcase and forgotten about. And it was only when one of their descendants found the suitcase in the year 2003 in response to a call out by the Globe and Mail, actually, looking for family history, family objects related to the history of the Great War in Canada, that their descendants made this discovery and donated it to the War Museum in Ottawa.
That like the journey that the bear went on, but also just the emotional journey of that story is so impactful, because you can imagine a child giving these souvenirs to their fathers, to their parents, but also just like the process of holding that onto your body. I'm sorry, did you say how old Aileen was when her father went to war?
Yeah, she was 10 years old in
Mm.
1915. Yeah.
It must have been a very oddly not odd and emotional experience to get that bear back in particular. I wonder what memories she carried with that through her whole life of that particular thing. Are there other records related to the family?
Yes, yeah, there are actually, and some are digitized, and would be available for teachers to use in classroom activities, but some are not. So first of all, if you're interested in looking for digitized sources related to this family's experience of the First World War, Library and Archives Canada, of course, as a way to, I would say, mark the centenary of the First World War, they digitized the service records of every member of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So an enormous undertaking, and I just checked today, and you can log on to Library and Archives Canada website and find Lawrence Rogers' military records. You can find the papers that he signed when he signed up, his pay sheets. He received a medal at one point, but also some correspondence related to his death. He also wrote a lot of letters. Well, he exchanged a lot of letters with his wife, May, his son, Howard, and Aileen, his daughter. And the letters, of course, that his wife and kids sent to him in England and in the trenches in France and Belgium, they have not survived. And actually, Lawrence Rogers, he has no known grave. His name is listed on the Menin Gate in Belgium. So, but the letters that he wrote to his family were kept along with this teddy bear, and you can consult them if you make an appointment and go to the archives at the Canadian War Museum. And so that, I would say, so I've done a lot of research with family correspondence related to the First World War. And I would say that even when because it's not a surprise. Like, I know that this man was killed in the fall of 1970.
Right.
But reading through the correspondence, getting a sense of individual personalities, and essentially you're kind of watching the clock tick down mentally as you approach what you know is going to be the last letter that he sends to his family. So yeah, I would say that's always kind of, just in terms of emotions that researchers experience, I would say that one is always difficult. And I would say that having this object as well something that this girl had touched in 1915, something that her father had touched. And I think the fact that it's a teddy bear as well, like this is a kind of a consumer object that is so linked with these sort of modern ideas about priceless childhood innocence.
Mhm.
That, basically childhood is a time when you're supposed to play and not have any worries. But the fact is that even on the Canadian home front, thousands of miles away from where fighting was happening, children's lives were still affected.
Yeah.
And I think that thinking about that material object is a useful way to think about that.
Yeah. When you're saying like reading the letters and like thinking about like kind of counting down, like knowing he's going to die, a similar thing happened when I was managing the Dear Sadie exhibit at the Archives of Ontario in 2015. Like
Of
we
course.
know he died. We know they both died, but one of them didn't die in the war.
Yeah.
And yet, reading that last letter, we were all just weeping. And one of the things that, because we were using that exhibit to work with 15-year-olds so much, that sometimes the 15-year-olds were finding things in the letters that we didn't notice. And it really, really struck me at that time the way that youth intersect with war in such a unique way, and that
Mhm.
often we intersect war with nation, but what does it mean to really think about youth related to war as one of the kind of main foci, to think about how so much of childhood and adolescence and growing up and who you're going to be and who you can't be because perhaps if you're a young soldier, you've passed away. It's really, it holds a totally different weight, I think, when I started to think about World War One and Two in particular with that lens. Why do you think that when you're looking at family correspondence, for example, why do you think that could be an element that teachers could bring into the classroom, or how, I guess, rather than why, to bring into the classroom to be able to show like different nuances of war, different complexities?
Oh, that's a great question. I think one kind of basic answer, actually, and it's one that I have found as well teaching undergraduate students and using
Hmm.
some of this material, because I'm teaching a course about the First World War right now. And, these are students who are in their, I would say, late teens, early 20s,
Yeah.
mostly. And I have found that reframing the history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force,
Hmm.
for example, but also I would say the history of warfare more generally as a history of youth, like is trench
Yes.
culture a kind of youth culture, for example.
Right.
And, because I would say that while Tim Cook, for example, has a really great article tracing debates about, but also experiences of underage boys who often successfully tried to join the army and made it overseas during the war. The fact is that a lot of men who enlisted legally, uh, but who were really barely out of their teens or in their early 20s, if you think of youth as a stage of life where you have yet to attain, a series of conventional markers of adulthood, whether that's moving out, not living with your parents anymore, being married, being finished your education. And I would say those two in the early 20th century, especially if you're a man, being finished your education or whatever kind of vocational training you were undertaking, and earning a living. A lot of these guys they hadn't done that yet. And
Yeah.
so I have found that framing the experiences of even these, youthful adults I would say that has been an effective way to open up these conversations in the undergraduate classroom. And I think that just as far as what the points that you were making about young people and warfare as being, like these are really intertwined topics that I would say for a long time, until the past maybe 20 years, the historians just didn't pay that much attention to.
Yeah.
And then starting in the early 1990s, something changed, and it started with historians in France who basically noticed, with respect to the First World War, that there were all these, they're like alphabet books, children's lessons, Sunday school sermons, pedagogy change. So it's absolutely everywhere, and shaped the kinds of culture that, the kind of adult world in these different national contexts was offering to kids. But then I think when you bring in the question of family life, then I think it just demonstrates that even more.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I wonder if you could comment maybe on girlhood in particular. I mean, there was a source that we would talk about a lot at the Archives of Ontario. It was just, a girl that had doodled in a notebook. And I would say to students, like, when we learn Canadian history, when are we ever learning it from perspectives of young girls? And so much of girlhood can be pathologized or demonized or sexualized that I don't think like the complexity of their experience is often given their due, but your research is a real exception to that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about girlhood as we kind of wind up our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one example, a way into this, and you and I have talked about this in other contexts, that this was a source of frustration for me in my early graduate school days, where I knew I wanted to write about the history of girls and girlhood. But I found that, some even of my academic colleagues and professors just were a bit dismissive of that as a serious topic. And whereas, I would say I was on a mission to demonstrate that not only was it serious and worthy of study, but the history of girlhood. And I think if you look at armed conflict, this is one way to clearly demonstrate it, is also the history of things like nationalism, imperialism, economics. And so, but you're right, like that there are these evidentiary challenges that historians interested in girlhood face. So the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, where I've spent a bunch of time, that has Aileen Rogers' teddy bear, in its archival collections, there are two sources made by girls from the First World War. And this, of course, is just a tiny little drop in a huge bucket of thousands and thousands of documents produced during and after the war, mostly by men, and mostly, I would say, a reflection of that institution's official priorities, right? Which are about nation-centered narratives and, combat and the military. So those two sources are a scrapbook made by a girl from Ottawa named Jessie Tyrell, whose dad, I think, had been a mailman, and he enlisted. It includes some letters that he sent to her, photographs of her. She's quite young during the war years, so photographs of her basically with her favorite doll in a baby carriage. And so her father's sending her these really affectionate letters. She kind of is I'm not sure when she creates the scrapbook. There's a photo of him, but then the final couple of pages, it's of just a little slim thing, not too long, but the final couple of pages they include his death certificate. And so it's clear that, and a press clipping of the unveiling of the kind of official, unveiling of the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior in Westminster Abbey in 1920. So it's clear that she's trying to make sense of like the unfolding effects, even after the war, of his death on her life. And so I think thinking about the life course is an important part of this.
Mm-hmm.
The other source by a girl in the Canadian War Museum related to the First World War is a single letter. It's part of a larger family collection, mostly letters by a soldier named George Ormsby sent to his family in the Okanagan. And the letter is by a woman named Margaret Ormsby, who, she was a girl during the war, and it's kind of really, childlike handwriting, misspelled words. But Margaret Ormsby, of course, would go on to do a PhD in history at Bryn Mawr College, and she became one of the first academic historians of British Columbia, and she spent her career at UBC. So, yeah, but I think, like you were saying about, the question of what do you do with scribbles? and marginalia. So this is basically, she thanks her father, I think, for a bracelet that he had sent her while he was away overseas, serving in the army. She writes about a sleepover that was going to come, that she, seeing one of her friends. So I think it's just these snippets of kind of really fine-grained detail of individual lives. And I think that, when we're dealing with fragments like this, one of the things that I think we need to do is engage in a little informed speculation. And I think that this is exactly what you were doing when you were imagining how Aileen Rogers might have reacted to the news of her father's death, first of all, but then also to actually getting back, the teddy bear comes back, but your dad didn't. So I think that, thinking creatively, empathetically about these young historical subjects who have just left us with, kind of traces here and there, putting them in the broader context of other kinds of archival sources, things that we know about, teaching and learning in history. I think that can be, a useful way to bring this additional aspect, and I think a really interesting one, into our discussions of, the legacies of the war, the meaning of the war after 100 years plus now.
Yeah. And, a little comment about a sleepover is just a good reminder to a young person who may have gone to a sleepover that, just a reminder, there were people like you in the past as well. And Funke Aldejebi and Michelle Johnson, we did a really great video, and they talked about when you're doing research on enslaved people, for example, enslaved women in particular, there just are no records, and the importance of using historical imagination in doing history work. And I think this is another really good example, especially in learning history and trying to really get your students to understand themselves as historical actors. And your sleepover that you mark down on whatever social media platform kids are using these days could have significance in the museum just because you were there. And I think that's really powerful. But we know that there are a lot of just challenges because there aren't a lot of resources out there. So do you just want to comment a little bit more on the challenges as we finish our conversation, and then we can talk about you have a book coming out and where people can read more about this very topic in another collection that I did some videos on.
Oh yeah. So can you repeat the question actually?
Yeah. I just wanted to know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the archival challenges of doing childhood and girlhood work in the past. I know you talked about it a little,
Sure.
but I don't know if you want to be a little bit more specific, or I don't know, it maybe point teachers towards recognize to teachers where there are challenges and maybe how to work through them, if not just through historical imagination, but maybe through something else.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you
Okay,
for
great.
restating that so gorgeously. So I would say that this is how can I get into this answer? I already know what I'm going to say. So I think
Just
it has
right in the middle of the answer.
Yeah, right. Exactly. You'll follow. I know. So I think that it has to do with how historians, how we approach the kinds of evidence that are available. And there's a historian who, well, he died not too long ago. I'm a big fan of his work, and he was a lovely guy, called Desmond Morton, who wrote about the First World War. He has a great book called Fight or Pay about the experience of soldiers in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. But he also has a book about, or actually, I think Fight or Pay is the one about soldiers' families. When your number's up, that's the one about soldiers. But Fight or Pay, he writes, so it's basically, it's a book about the Canadian Patriotic Fund, which was this additional source of financial support for soldiers' wives and children during the war, the administration of which was kind of complicated. But he wrote at the beginning, kind of the preface of the book, that his initial inspiration or hope had been to write a book about the wives and children of Canadian soldiers. But he said immediately after that, but it turns out that was impossible because the sources that these people produced in writing to soldiers overseas, they have largely been destroyed, obliterated. They're just, in the mud of Flanders over there. So then, kind of having been trained as a historian in the moment than I did, decades after Desmond Morton, I had the advantage of, being aware of a whole bunch of scholarly methods that historians use to study the experience of people who didn't leave their own written records. And the history of slavery is a really important part of this story. But I would say women's history is another one, working class history. And these are all areas of historical study where naysayers have in the past said, there's no sources. You couldn't possibly write that stuff. So one of the things that I have been doing and that has proven to be, I would say a richer source of evidence than I'd even imagined was, of course, so we don't have too many letters from wives and children. There are some, which, is really like archival pay dirt, if you can get both sides of a written conversation.
Yep.
But even in soldiers' letters, because of course, some Canadian soldiers, if they survived the war, they could be gone for as many as 5 years. 1914 to demobilization in 1919. So that's a long time, in anyone's life, but especially in the life of a child. And so these soldiers, if they are fathers, and of course, married men with kids, they were not the majority of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, but, there are enough of them that I would say it is significant. So if you read soldiers' letters, you can learn so much about children, about what they're doing, about their report cards, about various health problems that they do. Aileen Rogers had polio, for example. And one of the things that you can see from reading her father's letters is the different, different types of treatments that she has to travel to New York at one point to get some treatment for one of her legs. So there's and emotional relationships between fathers and children, sibling rivalries. So there's so much that I would say, teachers and historians can learn by looking at those kinds of sources. And in terms of thinking about, how available are documents like this, I know that you have also done an episode in the past about the Canadian Letters and Images Project.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would recommend starting there if you're a teacher and interested in something in the classroom, trying to dig through records and looking for evidence of children's lives. Find a collection written by a soldier who had children and go from there. And I can guarantee that you'll find some interesting stuff.
That's so great. And there are so many projects that have transcribed the letters now. And I know people are like, oh, kids don't know how to read handwriting anymore. Handwriting is hard to read.
Full stop. Yep.
Yeah, it's hard to read. So don't think that that's just a barrier because it's students from this generation. That's a barrier. But there's so many ways that barrier has come down now. Because of such excellent historian work, but also just crowdsourcing work. So that's a really great reminder of all these different projects that allow that. So thank you so much, Kristine. So first, can you please tell people how they can read more about Aileen and the teddy bear, because I know that you've done some writing about it. And what's nice about filming this before but premiering it live is that we've already been able to provide the links down below. But maybe you could just say about where we can find that, and then I'm going to ask you about your new project and we'll wrap up.
Great, thank you. So I first discovered Aileen Rogers' teddy bear when I was working on a chapter for an edited collection by my colleagues and friends, Amy Shaw and Sarah Glassford, called A Sisterhood of Suffering and Service. And I believe that they have been on the show to talk to you maybe about
they about both books.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, about the World War I and World War II book. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So Yeah, so basically I knew that I was interested in family letters. I was at the War Museum archives to do that. And then I found the teddy bear, and then I thought, oh God, they actually have this man's letters here. So, and I also in that chapter talk about the scrapbook kept by this girl called Jessie Tyrell, whose father also died during the war. So that's kind of a double shot of girl produced or girl producer, girl adjacent archival discoveries that made their way into that chapter. And I have also just finished with Barbara Lawrence-Kowski from Concordia University and Andrew Birch, who is a historian at the War Museum in Ottawa. We've just finished editing a collection called Small Stories of War, Childhood, Youth, and Combat in Canada and Beyond. That is, yeah. And so there's more about soldiers, children, gender, family, letter writing in there, but it also just has a real kind of a sweeping geographic and temporal scope. It covers basically the whole of the 20th century, from the First World War, including German school children's drawings, Canadian soldiers' kids, all the way through the Second World War, evacuees, life kind of in Halifax Harbor, the Cold War, civil defense, and parents being worried that their kids would get too scared about nuclear war. But then also more recent conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, surviving the Rwandan genocide as a 10-year-old girl, essentially. It also talks about the children of Canadian soldiers during the more recent war in Afghanistan. And there was some really, really remarkable parallels there between what the authors of that chapter found in the early 21st century and what I found with respect to the 20th century. So and then also Miriam Denov, who teaches at McGill, has a chapter about children born of wartime rape in northern Uganda. So it's really, I would say, the breadth of the subject matter feels almost a bit incommensurate. Like, how can you write about white Canadian children who had a pretty good war on the home front with respect? How can you write about that in the same frame as survivors of genocide, or kids in Africa having post-traumatic nightmares and talking about in their play skipping across human bones in the bush? So I think that and one of the things that we say there is that actually those jarring juxtapositions are the point. Right. And I would say part of it is to show that we need to do more in terms of looking beyond the histories of white kids, in terms of how the history of warfare has intersected with Canadian history. But I think also just as a continual reminder of the fact that this ideal of childhood innocence, of childhood as a time protected from politics, protected from violence, protected from anything pleasant or scary, and if you look historically, that's only ever been the reality for a pretty small proportion of young people.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking about more contemporary examples related to countries that aren't just Canada, I was thinking about the fact that there are so many refugee children in schools now, or parents who were refugees and their children are in school now, and how even just engaging with a collection like that can help teachers better understand some of the experiences of students in their classroom when it might be so far from their own experiences. But when I talked to Dr. Sarah Glassford in 2020 for the pandemic pedagogy series, and then she mentioned the World War II book, and I was like, Sarah, why aren't we talking about that? Let's get authors from your collection to have some videos. And so I'm going to say the same thing to you, Kristine. But we should probably, it would be so great to be able to talk to some of the authors from that collection as a way to promote the book coming out. When is it coming out again, and what publisher is it?
So it's being published by McGill Queens, who have been an absolute dream to work with.
That's
And
wonderful.
we're hoping for sometime spring 2023. Exact date, TBD, to be determined.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure that when it is less D, I guess, or more D, less TB. That seems weird. We will do some promoting, but let's maybe have the conversation more, because it'd be great to be able to promote the book and the project a little bit more. But Kristine, this was so fantastic. Thank you so much for being part of our Remembrance Day special premiere live event. How can people get a hold of you if they want to learn more about your work? Do you have a website, Twitter?
Yeah, so people can find me on Twitter. My handle there is, well, before who knows what's going to happen to Twitter, but right now people can find me on Twitter.
It's this week. We're just promoting it this week, so right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So at Kristine Alexander. So, and that's Kristine with a K, and the first part of my surname, at Kristine Alexander. And I clearly need to get a professional website. You can find me if you Google Kristine Alexander, University of Lethbridge, and that will bring you to an institutional page with my email address.
Okay, I did not want to put any pressure on you to create a website, so I'm sorry about that. You just work on the book, edited collection. But all of those links,
to-do list for a very long time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it was like 2004. You were like, I could do a website.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
But
all those links are down below. Also, we've been tweeting about a lot of these different links as well, so you can go on our Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest, and well, I guess you're already on YouTube, Facebook, did I say that? And be able to see a lot more of those links and content and all that. So thank you so much, Kristine, and let's stay in touch.
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Samantha.
Bye.
Bye.